So Chris, thank you so much for joining. It looks like you're joining from, I think I recognize the New York skyline in the background. Is that right?
Yeah, that is right. Yeah, a little bit more urban than your sort of beautiful tree-lined environment.
It seems we've taken different approaches to navigating the COVID awkwardness. Can you just start maybe by giving people a bit of background on yourself, what you cover academically, and what your focus has been at Cornell?
Sure, yeah. So yeah, professor at Cornell, and I research and teach on two broad topics, I guess. So one is, how business can be more sustainable and resilient. So things like covering social businesses like B Corps, environmental sustainability initiatives. I teach a class on social entrepreneurship. So that's one of my main teaching responsibilities. Another related set of research actually looks at sustainability, social responsibility in China, and also entrepreneurship. And then the other set of responsibilities teaching-wise I teach a class on doing business in China. And also every year I lead a group of students to China, and we visit leading companies there, and that's part of a class as well.
Wow, that's really interesting. And you have a new book that's coming out, Better Business. I'd be curious to learn more about the book and its topic, but just
sure.
From a motivation standpoint, like what prompted you to write that?
Yeah, so I've been researching this topic of like businesses impacting society for now probably about 15 years. And I think that, so the focal sort of case of the book is the B Corp movement, which I can explain a little bit in a second. But so as I've been studying this for a long time, I've really come to the conclusion, I think this is one of the most important sort of business trends of our time. You and your viewers are probably familiar with, the Business Roundtable has come out saying that companies should be more stakeholder focused. The World Economic Forum focused on stakeholder capitalism. Even, big investors like Larry Fink are saying, from BlackRock, are saying, businesses should have a purpose. And these things are easier said than done. And what I find a lot about the B Corp tools and processes and model really compelling is it somewhat provides a playbook for companies to become more stakeholder driven, to focus more on their employees, communities, environment, suppliers, et cetera. So, I think there's been this groundswell of support from these leading actors outside the movement saying we should be more stakeholder oriented. And I think that the B Corp movement is really important because it sort of says how you can do that. And also, put some teeth in it. It's not just like you're saying it, but you're actually doing it.
Yeah, and from our perspective as a firm that recently became a B Corp, that was the motivation on our side, right? It was we cared about our stakeholders, we cared about conforming to criteria, but we didn't want to have to invent all those criteria. We didn't want to have to invent the audit. We wanted some way of doing it and almost inheriting a playbook from other firms. And I think that's really powerful, right? Because a lot of these companies that become B Corps are busy. They're doing lots of things. So maybe before we even go down the path of B Corps, can you just frame for people what a B Corp is? And actually, I noticed in your preface, I'm going to quote, it says, the B Corp movement is the most important social movement you've never heard of. Just explain that to people. Why have they never heard of it? Why is it so important?
Sure. Well, first of all, sort of what a B Corp is. I mean, you sort of alluded to it in why, Fifth Wall is a B Corp. But, it's a company that's certified, whose like social environmental performance has been certified by a nonprofit, B Lab. And, there's many certifications. People, I'm sure, are more familiar maybe with fair trade, organic, in the real estate industry, LEED certified buildings. But the B Corp certification is really the only certification that certifies a whole company. And, in addition to Fifth Wall, like companies like Patagonia, Seventh Generation, Ben & Jerry's, like really famous socially focused companies. But then, Hootsuite, Kickstarter, Allbirds, Bombas, many, sort of really the most sort of cool and innovative companies nowadays, to even like Danone, a very traditional, sort of company from France, has 20 B Corp certified. King Arthur Flour is, from a company from 1790, also certified, employee owned. So it's a movement of companies, committing and going through processes to become more socially and environmentally sustainable. So why, to your sort of question, is it's so important, despite the fact that people haven't heard about it, is that I think that in the last 50 years in the US, the dominant ideology of companies is around delivering profits to shareholders. So this idea of shareholder primacy, and companies that are public, they're on this sort of hamster wheel of delivering quarterly profits. Alignment of CEOs through stock options and other mechanisms with the share price, really, very narrowly focuses the companies on shareholders. And I think what the B Corp movement says is that, we should be much more about stakeholders. And I think that the shareholder capitalism that we have sort of gone down the path of for 50 years is, really the root cause of many of the systematic problems we have in our country, like, inequality and environmental destruction. I think that the people don't realize that, because, they feel that that's sort of the natural way capitalism is, but actually it's only been that way for the last 50 years. Before then, it was, employees had generous pensions, companies were, really active in their communities. And so I think, the B Corp movement, one reason why it's the sort of important social movement is that it's sort of reorients the thinking about companies in a way that people are not necessarily used to. The second thing is that for this change to really take place, to shift to more stakeholder capitalism, it has to be also something consumers want. And I think there's a lot of sort of indication and evidence, and particularly like, millennials and Gen Z wanting much more socially responsible businesses. But I think that, this is, getting awareness of B corporations, companies that are authentically committed to, purpose beyond shareholders, is, needs to get more attention. And so, it's great that I'm, here today talking to you about it. And it's great that Fifth Wall is a B Corp also.
Yeah, I'm curious just to dig in on some of the things you mentioned. So you use this word stakeholder, and I think when people conceptualize what a stakeholder is, the idea of a stock owner is kind of the most intuitive. Right. And maybe that's a function of how we've defined businesses to date. What are some of the kind of big frameworks to view your stakeholders as a business that might not be obvious to people? Like, how would you define the different cohorts of stakeholders for a business?
Sure. So, in some ways you can think about, stakeholders that are sort of more inside the company and those that are sort of in some ways outside the company. So, if you think about inside the company, the most important stakeholder is the employees. Suppliers also are, sort of hybrid, inside, outside the company, very involved obviously in producing the company's products. Outside the company, you have consumers, the governments, and the communities that the companies are in, and then investors. And the investors are the ones, sort of the stockholders, that obviously have taken such a primary role. But, there's a lot of evidence that, companies are much more sustainable long-term if they actually put a lot of effort in focusing on the broader set of stakeholders, much more resilient. If a company is just focusing on its shareholders, things like, probably higher employee turnover because they're not treating the employees well. Maybe ends up being, issues with, product quality and other things with consumers, poor supplier relations. So really it's an ecosystem around the company that for long-term sustainability, companies need to be focusing on the whole, not just the one number of earnings per share, basically.
And what's interesting is when you think about, where we find ourselves now in the midst of this pandemic and kind of the economic and social and cultural fallout from it, is that I think real estate owners, to a greater extent than they ever have before, have had to internalize how many stakeholders they do in fact have. meaning, if someone is occupying your building or living in your building, and how they interact with other tenants and how that relates to government mandates around, stay-at-home orders, the number of constituents that a real estate owner touches, the stakeholders to them is so broad that it's almost thrust that responsibility, I think, on real estate owners in a way that they never had to think of before. They never had to self-conceptualize that way. It's interesting.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I think that the real estate industry, for many reasons, is one of the most complex industries that we have. And, your point illustrates, I gave you sort of these big buckets of stakeholders, but every company and industry has its own sort of unique set of stakeholders. And so I can see in the real estate industry that all of the, from tenants to the tenants' clients to, whomever, are very important stakeholders that some plan, particularly in the situation, in the past number of months, that needs to be dealt with in some way.
And in the same time, in that same vein, you also have, tenants that are now recognizing that my health and public health is kind of in many ways in the hands of landlords and the decisions they're making and the economic trade-offs and the public health trade-offs that they must consider in making those decisions. But another thing you mentioned that I thought was really interesting was, I think you talked about how it's a younger movement, right? This is kind of millennial driven. And we've seen that, I'd say in the real estate world, we see is that for a lot of companies that have a lot of younger millennial employees, the concept of being sustainable, right? Or being a socially conscious organization is non-negotiable. It's table stakes. And because their companies are like that, when they're leasing space from a landlord, their requirements of that landlord are much higher than tenants 5-10 years ago. How have you seen that play out? Like, how much is this a youth movement? And do you think it will always kind of have that pressure, that impetus from youth?
Yeah, I think definitely. I mean, the youth, particularly, the millennials, Gen Z, have been tremendous powers behind this movement. And I think that, if you look at sort of the research, and I've learned this myself through my students, I've been teaching on this, for 10 or 15 years. Before being at Cornell, I was at Harvard Business School and Kennedy School for over 10 years. And really, it was my students' enthusiasm that drew me into this topic. And, similar to like you were saying in the real estate industry, individuals, when they want to work for a company, when they look for products, they want something that aligns with their purpose and their idea and vision as a person. And so, there's this interest in being consistent in some way. And so I think that's obviously, tremendously important in supporting these companies and the people that go to work for them. I also think another interesting thing is that if you look at surveys, I haven't had sort of experience with this myself, but there's indications that the youth are much less enthusiastic about capitalism as a system in general, and feel that the economic system needs to be substantially reformed to take care of a wider variety of people. And I think that plays into it because these businesses are much more responsive. And then finally, to the sort of long-term trend of this, there's been some discussion that sort of as the baby boomers pass their wealth on to this younger generation, it's a huge amount. I mean, 40 trillion dollars. And so, I do think that this demographic that, is really, living their values in, through their purchases, through the work that they do, will have a lot of power moving forward.
And you've covered this movement, right, since 2007. And so I imagine it's changed a lot since then. What have been some of the themes and the trends around that change that are interesting?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that is really, and it connects to the youth, is the passion of the people that are involved in this. I mean, these are people that want to change the world. They want to do it collaboratively. I think that in the U.S. culture, the idea of like an entrepreneur is like a solo hero, like Steve Jobs or Elon Musk. But really, these companies and individuals, they want to work together, partner to really make the world better. You know, and so within this B Corp community, there's all these interesting partnerships. I mean, you know, the sort of the funniest ones are that I find are between Ben and Jerry's, the ice cream maker, and New Belgium Brewing, the beer maker. They have teamed up to make beer flavored ice cream and some sort of ice cream flavored beer, which is sort of you know, I mean, I think they did it because they thought, you know, they liked each other so much, and it was sort of interesting combination. But there's tons of collaboration in this ecosystem, which I think makes everyone better and the impact even stronger. I think sort of the second thing that has really impressed me over time is how the movement has shifted from just being about B corporations to being about all corporations. So, you know, so I've published some HBS case studies about B Lab and B corporations. And in 2010, the first HBS case study I published, the title of it, I think, was B Lab, you know, creating a new sector of the economy. So it was about these B corporations, and they were not regular businesses. They were not nonprofits. They were a new sector where it was sort of this hybrid in the middle. But, you know, really in the last, you know, half a decade, maybe, you know, 7-8 years, the change strategy has shifted to, you know, actually, it's not about a separate segment of the economy. It's actually about the whole economy. And how can we create the tools, processes to make, so all companies can be more like B Corps, and all companies can be more socially responsible, and we can be a more stakeholder driven economy.
That's interesting, like thinking about the ethos of what being a B Corp means kind of colliding with traditional business, and just thrusting responsibility on traditional businesses that are non-B Corps, because of the success that has been seen with B Corps. So I'm curious, how is the composition of companies that ultimately become B Corps? Has that changed? Have you seen just dynamics that are interesting there? Or are there particular kinds of companies that are more likely to become a B Corp? And I guess the related question is, when are they becoming B Corps? Is it earlier in their maturation?
So I think that early on, it was smaller companies, you know, that you would say, okay, that's a B Corp, like, you know, Patagonia with this sort of long-standing environment commitment, you know, Ben and Jerry's, deep social activism. So these companies that were really sort of well-known, the larger ones, and then the smaller companies that were the entrepreneurs were really sort of focused on social entrepreneurship. The thing that where I think the scale of this is really going to grow exponentially is the extent to which large companies have jumped on board in the past number of years. So for instance, I just today on Forbes published an article about Athleta, you know, the sort of yoga apparel brand that's a subsidiary of Gap. It's a B corporation, and, you know, has been certified for a couple years now. Large company. Danone, the $30 billion French multinational, has committed to being the first sort of global multinational B Corp. They've certified over 20 of their subsidiaries. The largest B Corp is actually Danone's North American subsidiary. So if you buy, you know, Danone or Oikos or other yogurt, you know, they own White Wave, so Horizon, Milks, Silk. There'll probably be a B Corp logo on the back of that. So these large companies are really jumping on board. And I think that also it's gathered steam outside the United States. So this started by entrepreneurs in the US, and there's so much interest outside the US that, you know, and it was very much a ground sort of grassroots type of movement where entrepreneurs from Latin America or Europe, they actually became enthusiastic about this and brought it to their company. And now actually over 50% of the B Corps are outside of the US.
That's interesting. And are there any trends there? Like, are they predominantly concentrated in Europe or in Asia? Are there any interesting trends around just geographically where they locate?
Sure. So, you know, as you guess, I mean, it is frequently the more developed countries. So Europe has a big cluster, UK, Latin America. Actually, the first international expansion was to Latin America, some entrepreneurs there. found this model and brought it to Latin America. And actually, interestingly enough, two of the countries in the world that have passed benefit corporation law, so it's a sort of a parallel legal innovation where companies can sort of within the, encode within their sort of operating documents, stakeholder driven language, are Colombia and Ecuador. So Latin America is really a leader on this topic. And Australia is another big hotspot. However, growing demand in China, for instance, I've studied a number of B corporations in China. So it's really all over the world.
And have you seen much of a collision between, becoming a B Corp and traditional asset management? And the reason I asked the question is, when Fifth Wall decided to become a B Corp, it was obviously very important for us to do. And
right.
We just assumed that lots of other venture funds were, although we hadn't really checked it out. And
right.
when we became one, we actually learned that Fifth Wall is the second largest venture capital B Corp. Have you seen more of that, or do you see that accelerating more in the asset management space?
I think so. I mean, this is something, when I first started studying this, there was very little interest from, I think, just investors, broadly speaking. And then, there was an uptake in impact investors. So, RSF Capital Management, Bridges, some sort of, well-known ones that are B Corps, and really found value and in the tools that B Lab had to, then a lot of entrepreneurial companies, like for instance, Allbirds, which I think you're an investor in, has a number of mainstream venture capital companies. Laureate is an example of the first public in the U.S. B Corp. Had KKR, sort of the famous corporate raiders from the from the RJR Nabisco deal. So I think that it has gained traction among these more mainstream investors over time. And I think, as you probably know, Laureate was the first public B Corp. I think it went public in 2017. And just in the last week, a B Corp went public, Vital Farms. And earlier in last month, in July, another B Corp, Lemonade, which is an online insurance company, also went public. So just in the last month, there's been two B Corps going public. Over time, I think all of the major, sort of VC PE firms from Kleiner Perkins, TPG, have a B Corp in their portfolio. I mean, you guys, before you became a B Corp. So I do think this is something where it's like an exponential. I've seen, exponential growth, and I think it'll only increase.
Yeah, and I think just, being in the real estate sector, where I don't think there are an enormous number of B Corps, when we announced that we had become one, we got a lot of feedback, very positive, from real estate owners and operators and developers that really cared about that, saw that as important. And maybe that's a good transition into, talking about climate change.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to get your perspective on climate change. Obviously, that's a big part of, sustainability and what becoming a B Corp means. And it seems like this crisis and the ensuing slowdown in the economy has given people a window to experience what that means in terms of reducing our emissions. And I think the feedback has been very positive from that. But how do we make that stick? How do we make that realization, that recognition that, reducing our emissions is important? How do we make that durable on the other side of this crisis?
Yeah, so I think I totally am with you on this, and it's a big challenge and puzzle. And, if you think about like where like sort of the big pollution centers are, I mean, China is a big one. And, I've read, there was a huge, as you probably saw, they had all these, satellite images of like Wuhan city where things broke out, or Beijing, and just how things had totally cleared out over, the air had cleared over a month. However, China, I'm not that optimistic about along these lines, to be honest. I just read a report that came out that actually the sort of pollution levels are back to being worse than before the pandemic. And, there's what this shows basically, which is not surprising, or there's a direct correlation and trade-off between economic growth and pollution. And I think in China, with the government now sort of really wanting to, stay in control in a very firm way, I think it's very unlikely that they'll sort of dial back that the sort of push for economic growth. In the U.S., maybe a little bit more optimistic. Pollution issues are not as bad, although certainly could be improved. And I think part of the reason why I'm more optimistic is, what we were discussing earlier. I think there is an understanding that we're at a tipping point in the world, and the business needs to be more stakeholder focused. I mean, of course, this also relies on political leadership and sort of understanding the science behind that actually climate change is a real serious issue. But I do think that the folks that are really pushing from the business side around, focusing on stakeholders sort of get that, climate is a really important, the environment is really important to be paying attention to. And the government, even though I don't think the federal government is as responsive at this point, I do think a lot of, city and state governments are ramping up some of their policies. So I think through sort of all of that action, I am hopeful that we can build on this sort of respite of pollution that we've had due to not great circumstances.
And it's interesting that you brought up regulation, because new local regulation, especially around carbon neutrality, has really been kind of the driver for the real estate industry's new focus on sustainability. But, one of the things we realized as we were looking at the space is it's actually shocking how contributive the real estate industry is to climate change. And, the stats are remarkable. It's the real estate industry is responsible for 40% of all raw materials. It's 40% of the world's energy consumption and 30% of greenhouse gases. The real estate industry, which in the US is about 13% of US GDP. And so I found those stats staggering. And the most interesting part of that was, why has the real estate industry kind of skirted the spotlight in a way where I think if you ask the average consumer what industries are most responsible or most culpable for climate change, reflexively they would say heavy manufacturing and transportation. But real estate dwarfs them. I'm curious, from your perspective, why has the real estate industry been able to skirt the spotlight and kind of almost not take responsibility for its role in climate change? Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think that's a real interesting question. I mean, I think part of it is, like you're saying, it's not obvious. I mean, if you look at, I grew up in Pittsburgh, and when I grew up, it was sort of, all the factories were sort of winding down. But I remember, as when I was little, and we would drive into the city for, various events, there was a variety of steel mills along the river, and you could see them belching out smoke, and sometimes fire was coming out, and I think so. It's real obvious, if you can see sort of a factory, sort of emitting smoke, or cars, emitting emissions from their tailpipes. I mean, this is something that's very sort of salient and evocative to people. Whereas for real estate, it's it's probably, a lot of it's through, I don't know, maybe not, I'm not an expert in real estate, but, if the things aren't insulated well, or, one of the things that, I've renovated a few homes, and it's really surprising to me how sort of like bespoke everything is in real estate. So, it's not like, even in manufacturing, things can be done a very standardized way, but if you're making a building, it's unique to that site. And so as a result, there's probably a lot more waste because things are not standardized. There's many different sort of crafts involved, so that people are, doing things, a lot more coordination and difficulty. So, one of the companies in China that I studied that was really interesting is a company called Broad Air, and they actually make prefabricated buildings. They have these videos online, which are just amazing, where they put up a building in, 20-story building in like a week. And, when I met with the CEO there and talked to him, he mentioned this idea of like how buildings being bespoke really leads to a tremendous amount of waste. And if you could have standardized prefab buildings that would really, have dramatic effect on the environment. So I think, got a little far off, off the question, but I do think it's a really unique problem, because I can understand why people want to have unique and interesting buildings that fit the site really well, but almost by definition, that's going to lead to more waste, both material-wise, but then also generally pollution and environment.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I'm always curious to get people's perspective on it, because it feels from our vantage point like there's been this triangulation of forces that have kind of put the real estate industry in the center of focus, which is these new regulations, the new carbon neutrality laws, in particular in New York and Los Angeles, which are kind of forebearers of what I think we're likely to see throughout the US, mandating carbon neutrality, mandating the Paris standards. The second is actually also really interesting, which is capital markets. So, large buyers of real estate debt, lenders, insurance companies, large buyers of REIT public equities are saying, we want to provide advantaged access. We want to preferentially deploy capital to lower no impact, carbon impact real estate. And that's obviously impacted cost of capital for real estate companies. And then on the consumer side, on the demand side, you're seeing tenants like we were just talking about, these typically technology driven tenants that have younger millennial workforces saying, these are our standards. We won't lease space from you. So if you don't conform to this, there's no demand for space. And it's like the real estate industry has been thrust in the middle of it. And the interesting thing, the fascinating thing about the real estate industry is it's one of the only industries you can't move, right? So you can't move a building. So all the buildings behind you, if those owners don't like the new local regulations, they can't just pick that building up and move it to Texas. Actually, they have to conform. And so there's a permanence to real estate that almost makes it more governable. And the other interesting thing I'm always curious about is, how do you audit this? It seems like one of the drivers that has pushed the real estate industry into focus is the fact that you can now measure the carbon footprint of a building. And I always think about this axiom that regulators tend to tax whatever you can measure. And since you can now measure it, you can tax it. Do you think that's one of the major drivers here?
I definitely think so. I mean, I think that in a few ways, and I think, I mean, I think that, like you're saying, I mean, I've heard, the capital markets, I mean, obviously, sort of Larry Fink being a famous example of saying really, focusing on sustainability is about the long term. And, part of it is that it's going to be regulations. I think also, in addition to your sort of consumer or demand side point, I mean, I've talked to so many companies that want themselves to go carbon neutral, and frequently they don't own the buildings that they're in. And so that creates, I think, sort of upstream pressure on their landlord. And I think more generally, this idea of measuring is, tremendously important. And I think that, maybe, government might measure something and then want to tax it. But I think that businesses, when they measure something, they want to make it more efficient and more, and sort of, squeeze out the unnecessary cost, whether it's through an ideology of wanting to do better for the environment, or, if you read Larry Fink's latest letter, he talks about half of it. I mean, it's the half that doesn't get as much attention as the first half on purpose, but he talks about sustainability standards. And he says that companies should be using these like they use financial metrics. And the idea that, you sort of track, measure, report, and it creates a discipline within the organization that you actually, become better on those dimensions. But then also, if you're transparent, then external actors can also assess you. So I do think there's a lot of power. It's not very sexy. I mean, if you think, sort of SpaceX or Tesla is sort of a sexy innovation, but I think that the innovations that are made in this measurement space are hugely important for impacting our environment.
And with all that said, there's obviously a lot of individuals in the real estate industry that listen to this. What can the real estate industry learn from other industries, from other paradigms that other templates of how to approach this that you think would just be useful for owners to consider? And the reason I think of that is that what has surprised me as I've dug into the space is how little the real estate industry itself invests in the technology to achieve carbon neutrality. Meaning, if you go on any real estate company's website, you see lots of splashy, grandstanding statements about, which kind of looks like glorified greenwashing, right? Because you don't see dollar signs. And I think about the contrast of that to what Microsoft or what Amazon have done in saying, we're going to commit $1 billion, $2 billion into the technology that is actually going to enable us to achieve carbon neutrality. And there's a disjuncture there that's kind of obvious for such a large industry like real estate. What can be learned, I guess, as a real estate owner in terms of how to embrace that responsibility?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't want to be repetitive, but I do think that there is something to be said for this idea of measuring, tracking in reporting, and I think that that's in some ways almost like a first step or even a baseline. I think too, setting goals again sounds sort of simple, but I think that many of the organizations like you described, that's what they're doing. They're putting dollars against it as well, but they're saying, okay, we're going to be, carbon neutral by 2030. And, that kicks off a whole set of work and processes within those firms for people to creatively think about how to actually do it. I mean, this is something that I've seen again and again in the companies that I've studied, is that, the people that have like all the ideas of how to actually innovate and change, or not all of them, but most of them are actually on the front lines. They're actually the day-to-day, could be building managers or whomever. And they, if there is actually a goal and potentially not even a big incentive, an incentive to actually get them thinking about how actually through either the work that they do themselves or the environment they're in, how it could be changed. I mean, that really opens up a tremendous amount of innovation. And it's really, that's the kind of innovation that's necessary to get like the last few miles on this. I mean, there could be big things like, I don't know, solar panels or retrofitting insulation, or, read a lot of really interesting things about what they've done to the Empire State Building recently. But I think that really to unleash, innovation on it, I think you have to engage more of the frontline people.
I think that's totally right. And I think engaging those kind of frontline managers that really see waste in their organization, in this case, energy waste or efficiency waste, is like that first step. But it's interesting when you mentioned goals, because I've thought a lot about this with respect to the real estate industry. You do see these goals out there. We've seen many real estate companies come out and say, we have a goal of being carbon neutral by X date. And what's interesting about that is a scientific problem, right? Like, meaning science is what will get you to that outcome. Today, the science doesn't really exist to cost effectively bring real estate owners, anyone that owns one of the buildings behind you, to carbon neutrality. And so we have to be betting on science to move us there. And I kind of likened the analogy to, when Kennedy said, we're going to put a man on the moon before the end of the decade, right? It was this kind of bold, ambitious statement. And the daylight between where we are now and putting a man on the moon was science, investing in rockets and investing in NASA and real money deployed. And it feels like there's this disjuncture in the real estate space where these goals have been set and they're ambitious, and I think they're bold and they should be celebrated. But what you don't see is the commensurate amount of technology investment happening. There's a gap. It's like in that analogy of putting a man on the moon. It's like when Kennedy did that, or when he said that, instead of investing in NASA, instead of investing in rocket science, he invested in a lot of PR for NASA. And they were worrying about, how are we going to have the closed circuit televisions to broadcast the man landing on the moon? It's like, those are later stage problems. Let's first solve the science.
Yeah, totally.
And I've noticed this weird distinction in the real estate industry, where you see lots of like heads of sustainability and it feels very PR like. How do you think we as consumers can get owners of any business to recognize that investment in science is in part the way through? How do you create that, I don't know, that conclusion, that drive for them?
I mean, I think it's, I think all the consumers can do is point the company in the right direction through, I think it's harder for them to think like the second order, like how to get there and through technology. So, I think that's the onus of that is on the companies really to say, okay, our consumers want us to be carbon neutral, and we, obviously science and technology is a key way. I think it's hard to use consumers as a lever, and I don't know, like investors, I think could be more powerful on that. I think that also potentially, companies can work together. I mean, this is something that, real estate companies can come together in a consortium or, to fund various investment. It seems like this is something where, there's a real like collective action problem in some, or not problem, but opportunity where, actually by, sharing technology, and I'm sure some of this exists, sharing, technology, joint funding of initiatives, I think some of the work that you're doing sort of pools sort of resources from a variety of sort of real estate focused LPs and puts that into some interesting technology. So I think that's, a way is, because not every company should really have to reinvent every technology. I mean, if you could get to some standards that are, funded by a variety of leading industry participants, that's a much faster way and more efficient way to do it.
It's interesting the way you put that as a collective action problem, because it is exactly that. It's precisely that. It's a situation where the industry all has the same challenge. And to some extent, the way through is the same for the whole industry, which is, investment in climate science and climate tech. And we haven't figured out the right way to reinforce that message, candidly. We were even thinking like, whenever you look at a particular company's sustainability page, you start asking questions, which is like, just where are the dollar signs? Where's the dollars? Like, I see lots of talk, I see lots of tree planting, and that's fantastic, and I don't want to diminish that.
Right. But
meaning, alongside that and synchronous with it should be an investment in technology, and we haven't seen that. I guess the last question I have, just to kind of draw on just your experience, is where do you think the B Corp movement goes? Like, what does the future hold? Like, do you see a world where a significant portion of the companies on the Fortune 500 are B Corps or have some kind of socially conscious or environmentally conscious mandates that they self-adhere to? Like, what is that future for you?
Yeah, so I do think, maybe not every company will be a B Corp, but I think there'll be a lot more like B Corps. And I think that people will understand, and companies will understand, that they are sort of beholden to and responsive to diverse stakeholders beyond shareholders. And I think this is something where, the B Corp movement provides a lot of tools for companies to help them, sort of walk along that path to being more stakeholder driven. I do think, 30 years from now, hopefully less, 20 years from now, people will look back and say, companies that were just focused on shareholders, that's crazy. But companies that are much more focused on, variety of stakeholders is actually, the proven long-term, sustainable, resilient way to do business. And, many of, I think, the leading lights will be, B corporations. So, in addition to Danone, I think there's some other larger companies that are seriously thinking about sort of starting along the path. Many large companies have B Corps as subsidiaries, sort of from, Pepsi to Gap to Procter & Gamble to Campbell Soup to Anheuser-Busch. So I think that it's, a lot of companies are getting in on this. And I think that, the broader move towards stakeholder capitalism is only going to increase.
Well, obviously we totally agree and support all the work and all the research that you're doing. And it's actually inspiring to think that will be the future. We hope it is. And so anything we can do to help support the B Corp movement and the work that you're doing, we want to continue to do. So
super, and certainly having Fifth Wall be a B Corp and support B Corps is huge, and it's a really, I think, an indicator of how pervasive this movement is becoming.
Yeah, we hope so. I hope it only increases. Well, Chris, thank you so much for your time, and I look forward
really
to
my pleasure. Thanks so much.